November the 25th, 1177. The coastal plains of Palestine baked under a merciless sun as 26,000 battle-hardened soldiers of Islam's greatest warrior advanced toward Jerusalem. At their head rode Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, architect of Muslim unity, a commander who had never known defeat in open battle. His army was a juggernaut of professional Mamluks, Turkish horse archers, and Syrian cavalry, each man a veteran of countless campaigns. They moved with the confidence of inevitable victory, having already ravaged the countryside, burned Lydda, demolished Ramla, and scattered every Christian force foolish enough to oppose them. Jerusalem lay exposed, its garrison depleted, its walls undermanned, its fall seemingly a matter of days. What Saladin didn't know, what none of his commanders could have imagined, was that 80 miles to the south, a dying teenager was about to attempt the impossible. King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, 16 years old, his body ravaged by leprosy, was gathering every man who could hold a sword for a desperate gamble that would defy every principle of medieval warfare. He had perhaps 500 knights, maybe 2,000 infantry, facing an army more than 10 times his size. The mathematics of medieval combat were brutal and simple. Numbers meant everything. 3-to-1 odds were considered the minimum for a siege. 10-to-1 in open battle was suicide. Yet this leprous boy king was about to launch a cavalry charge that would shatter the legend of Saladin's invincibility and save Jerusalem through sheer audacity and faith. This is the story of the Battle of Montgisard, where disease, desperation, and divine intervention collided on a forgotten battlefield, and a teenage leper proved that courage could triumph over impossible odds. It's the story of how 500 knights destroyed an army, how a dying king became a legend, and how one November afternoon changed the course of the Crusades. The West calls it a miracle. The Muslims called it a catastrophe. The truth is somehow more remarkable than either version. Baldwin IV was born in 1161 to King Amalric I of Jerusalem and Agnes of Courtenay. From birth he was heir to the most precarious throne in Christendom, the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, that fragile Christian enclave carved from Muslim lands during the First Crusade 80 years earlier. The kingdom was a sliver of territory along the Mediterranean coast, surrounded by hostile Muslim states, dependent on a constant trickle of reinforcements from Europe, and perpetually one major defeat away from annihilation. Every king of Jerusalem lived with the knowledge that they ruled over a beautiful doomed experiment in religious colonization that could end at any moment. The boy's childhood was that of any medieval prince, learning to ride, to fight, to read Latin, to understand the complex politics of maintaining a Christian kingdom in a Muslim world. His tutor was William of Tyre, one of the great historians of the Crusader period, who would later record the terrible discovery that would define Baldwin's life. William noticed something disturbing during the prince's lessons. When Baldwin played with other noble children, engaging in the rough games boys always play, he never complained of pain when pinched or hurt. At first, William thought the boy simply had exceptional fortitude. Then he realized the truth. Baldwin couldn't feel the pain. He literally had no sensation in his right arm and hand. William of Tyre's chronicle records the moment of recognition with heartbreaking clarity. I began to be uneasy, and at length discovered that the boy's right hand was partially numb. I had him bathed in warm water and anointed with various ointments, but all to no purpose. For as he grew older, this condition became more serious. The physicians who were summoned at length pronounced it to be leprosy, an incurable disease, leprosy. In the 12th century, the word was a death sentence wrapped in religious stigma. The disease, caused by Mycobacterium leprae, attacks the peripheral nervous system, destroying the body's ability to feel pain. Without pain signals, injuries go unnoticed. Infections develop. Fingers and toes aren't eaten away by the disease itself, but lost to untreated wounds and the body's immune response. The face becomes disfigured. Blindness often follows. Throughout medieval Europe, lepers were considered ritually unclean, forced to wear special clothing, ring bells to announce their presence, and live in isolated leper colonies. They were legally dead, unable to inherit property, give testimony, or touch the healthy. But Baldwin was a prince. There would be no leper colony for him. When his father Amalric died in 1174, the 13-year-old leper became king of Jerusalem despite his condition. Despite the horror of the court physicians, despite the obvious impossibility of a diseased teenager ruling a warrior kingdom surrounded by enemies. The coronation was a moment of profound tragedy and courage. Baldwin, already showing signs of his disease, was crowned with full ceremony in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He swore the royal oath, knowing he was promising to defend a kingdom he might not live to see through adolescence. The nobles who knelt before him knew they were swearing fealty to a dying boy. But they did it anyway because Jerusalem needed a king, even a doomed one, and because Baldwin, despite his affliction, possessed something rare and precious, an iron will wrapped in a decaying body. The political situation Baldwin inherited was desperate. To the north lay the Principality of Antioch and the County of Tripoli, fellow Crusader states but often more concerned with their own survival than Jerusalem's. To the east and south lay the vast territories controlled by Saladin, who had risen from relatively obscure origins to become the most powerful Muslim leader since the early caliphs. Saladin's real name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub, born in 1137 or 1138 in Tikrit, modern-day Iraq, into a Kurdish military family. He had served as a soldier under Nur ad-Din, the emir of Damascus, and had risen through a combination of military brilliance and political cunning to control Egypt by 1171 and Syria by 1174. By the time Baldwin became king, Saladin was in the process of uniting the fractured Muslim world under his banner with one explicit goal: the destruction of the Crusader kingdoms and the recapture of Jerusalem. The early years of Baldwin's reign were a desperate holding action. The young king, advised by more experienced nobles, had to navigate a poisonous court filled with factions, jealousies, and competing ambitions. The arrival of Count Philip of Flanders in 1177 with a large contingent of European knights seemed like salvation. Philip was a powerful noble, experienced in warfare, with money and men. Baldwin, desperate for any advantage, proposed a joint campaign against Saladin's Egyptian power base. The plan was sound. Strike at Egypt while Saladin was occupied elsewhere, damage his economic base, and buy Jerusalem precious years of survival. But Count Philip had his own agenda. He demanded command of the entire operation and control of any conquests. Baldwin, despite his youth, understood that accepting these terms would mean surrendering his kingdom's independence to a European adventurer who would leave once his crusading vow was fulfilled. The young king refused. Philip, insulted, took his army north to the Principality of Antioch instead, leaving Jerusalem dangerously exposed. It was a catastrophic miscalculation by both men. Philip had underestimated the leprous teenager's political courage. Baldwin had lost a critical military asset just as Saladin was preparing his move. Saladin saw the opportunity immediately. Jerusalem's best fighting men had marched north with Count Philip. The kingdom's greatest warrior, Reynold of Châtillon, was campaigning in the south with a small force. The capital's garrison was depleted. The harvest was in, meaning his army could live off the land. October 1157 was the perfect moment to strike, not for a siege, Jerusalem's walls were still too strong for that, but for a devastating raid that would cripple the kingdom's economy and demonstrate Christian weakness. On October 18th, Saladin crossed the border from Egypt with an army that chroniclers numbered at 26,000 men. Modern historians debate the exact figure. Medieval numbers are notoriously unreliable, but even conservative estimates put Saladin's force at well over 20,000 combat effectives. This was not a raiding party. This was a professional army built for conquest. The core of Saladin's force was his Mamluk cavalry, slave soldiers trained from childhood in the arts of war. These were arguably the finest light cavalry in the medieval world, expert archers who could shoot accurately from horseback at full gallop, masters of the feigned retreat that would draw enemy knights into ambushes, disciplined professionals who fought not for plunder but for salary and prestige. Supporting them were Turkish horse archers, Syrian cavalrymen, Bedouin scouts, and Egyptian infantry. The army was well supplied, well organised, and led by commanders who had campaigned from North Africa to Mesopotamia. Saladin himself was at the height of his powers. 40 years old, experienced, confident, having unified Egypt and much of Syria through a combination of military victory and political acumen. The Muslim army advanced up the coast, deliberately avoiding the powerful Crusader fortress of Gaza. Too strong to assault quickly, they bypassed Ascalon, another fortified position. Saladin's strategy was clear. devastate the countryside, destroy Christian settlements, force Baldwin to either cower behind Jerusalem's walls and look weak or come out and be destroyed in the open field. Either outcome served Saladin's larger purpose of demonstrating that the Crusader kingdoms were doomed, that Muslim unity under his leadership was the future, and that Jerusalem's days were numbered. The towns of Lydda and Ramla were the first to feel the Muslim onslaught. Both were burned. Their populations, those who couldn't flee in time, were killed or enslaved. The smoke from burning villages could be seen for miles. Refugees streamed toward Jerusalem with tales of the Muslim army's size and ferocity. Panic spread through the Christian settlements. Saladin's army moved almost unopposed, encountering no significant resistance. A small Templar force attempted to shadow the Muslim army, but was far too weak to engage directly. The Sultan's confidence grew with each passing day. The Christians were terrified, divided, leaderless. Jerusalem might not even require a siege. Its economy could be destroyed, its countryside depopulated, and the kingdom would wither and die. In Jerusalem, Baldwin faced the gravest crisis of his young reign. His best troops were gone north with Count Philip. The city's garrison was minimal. He could defend the walls if necessary, but sitting in Jerusalem while Saladin ravaged the kingdom would be a political and moral disaster. The king's council was divided. Many urged caution. Wait for Count Philip to return. Wait for reinforcements. Don't risk the king's life and the kingdom's remaining military strength in a hopeless battle. But Baldwin, despite his diseased body, despite his youth, possessed the rarest quality in medieval kingship, the willingness to stake everything on a single desperate throw of the dice. The king made his decision. He would gather every available fighting man and march to intercept Saladin. It was madness by any rational calculation. He had perhaps 500 knights, maybe 2,000 infantry and crossbowmen, against Saladin's 26,000. The odds were so overwhelmingly against him that no competent commander would have attempted it. But Baldwin wasn't just a commander. He was a teenage Leper King fighting to save his kingdom and his soul. He believed, with the absolute certainty of medieval religious faith, that God would not abandon Jerusalem, that righteousness could triumph over numbers, that sometimes courage mattered more than calculations. On November 24th, Baldwin's tiny army marched out of Jerusalem. At its head rode the king himself, mounted on a warhorse despite the pain it must have caused his disease-ravaged body. Beside him was the most sacred relic in the Christian world, a fragment of the true cross, the actual wood upon which Christ was crucified, carried by the Bishop of Bethlehem. For medieval Christians, the true cross wasn't just a symbol, it was a physical piece of God's intervention in human history, a tangible connection to divine power. Its presence on the battlefield wasn't ceremonial, it was strategic. The knights believed, absolutely and without question, that fighting under the true cross meant fighting with God's direct blessing. Among the knights riding with Baldwin were the elite of what remained of Jerusalem's military strength. Reynald of Châtillon had been recalled from the south with his forces, adding crucial experienced fighters. Balian of Ibelin, one of the kingdom's most capable nobles, commanded a contingent. The military orders were represented, Knights Templar and Hospitaller, warrior monks who had taken vows of poverty and chastity, but spent their lives in almost constant combat against Islam. These were men who believed they were fighting a holy war, that death in battle against Muslims guaranteed salvation, that martyrdom was not something to fear, but to embrace. But even with this elite force, the numbers were catastrophic. Medieval cavalry charges required mass to be effective. The impact of heavy cavalry, knights in full armour on armoured warhorses, was devastating, but only if there were enough of them to maintain momentum and break enemy formations. 500 knights against 26,000 men wasn't a battle, it was suicide. Yet Baldwin marched anyway, driven by duty, faith, and the knowledge that doing nothing meant watching his kingdom die slowly. Saladin, meanwhile, had reached the fortress of Montgisard, about 30 miles northwest of Jerusalem near the coastal plain. The Muslim army was in high spirits. They had encountered no resistance, the raids had been successful, the countryside was burning. Saladin believed Baldwin was cowering in Jerusalem, that the Christian army had marched north with Count Philip, and that nothing stood between his army and completing their devastating raid. The Muslim forces were dispersed, scattered across the landscape in the way armies commonly deployed when not expecting immediate combat. Foraging parties ranged far from the main body, Units camped separately, the guard was down. Why maintain tight formation when the enemy was nowhere to be seen? Then, on November 25th, everything changed. Baldwin's scouts located Saladin's scattered army. The Muslim forces were spread out, vulnerable, not formed for battle. It was the opportunity Baldwin had been praying for, literally. The king called his commanders together. What he proposed was insane. A direct cavalry charge against an army 20 times their size. No feints, no manoeuvres, no clever tactics. Just a headlong assault relying entirely on surprise, shock and faith. The knights would charge in a single massive wedge, aiming directly at Saladin's command position. If they could reach the Sultan, kill or capture him, the Muslim army would collapse into chaos. If they failed, every Christian on the field would die. Baldwin of Ibelin, one of the more level-headed nobles, must have understood the mathematics of what Baldwin was proposing. But he also understood something else. This wasn't just a military decision, it was a spiritual one. The true cross was with them. The king, despite his rotting flesh, was willing to lead the charge himself. To refuse to counsel retreat would be to deny faith itself. Medieval warfare at this level wasn't just about tactics and numbers. It was about belief, about the conviction that God intervened directly in human affairs, that righteousness could overcome material disadvantage. To modern sensibilities, this seems like dangerous delusion. To 12th century knights, it was reality. The Bishop of Bethlehem raised the true cross. The knights knelt in prayer. Baldwin, his diseased hands barely able to grip his sword, spoke to his men. The exact words are lost to history, but the message was clear. They would charge. They would break through or die trying. Jerusalem depended on them. God was with them. There would be no retreat, no surrender, no consideration of the odds. Just faith, courage, and the hope that righteousness would prove stronger than numbers. The Crusader army formed up in a single wedge formation, the classic cavalry charge configuration designed to concentrate maximum force at a single point. At the tip of the wedge rode the best knights, the most experienced fighters, men whose names have been lost to history but who that day would perform miracles of courage. Behind them came the main body of knights, each man in full armour, mounted on warhorses bred and trained for combat, carrying lances designed to punch through armour at full gallop. At the centre of the formation, the true cross blazed in the afternoon sun, a visible reminder of what they fought for. And at the head of them all, impossibly rode Baldwin, a 16-year-old leper whose flesh was rotting off his bones, who had no feeling in his extremities, who should have been lying in a darkened room waiting to die. Instead, he was about to lead a cavalry charge against the most feared Muslim army of the age. The courage required to do this, to override every survival instinct, to deliberately ride toward near-certain death, is almost incomprehensible. But Baldwin did it because he was king, because Jerusalem needed him, because faith demanded it. The charge began at a trot, horses moving in formation, lances levelled, the entire wedge of armoured men and beasts building speed, gradually to maintain cohesion. Medieval cavalry charges weren't wild gallops. They were controlled accelerations designed to hit the enemy line with maximum impact at the critical moment. The discipline required was extraordinary. Every knight had to maintain his position, control his warhorse, watch the banners and adjust speed to match the formation. Break formation too early, and the charge lost its concentrated punch. Arrive ragged, and the enemy could defend in detail. The Muslim scouts who first spotted the Christian charge couldn't believe what they were seeing. A tiny force of cavalry emerging from cover and forming for attack, against Saladin's entire army. The scouts raced back to warn their commanders, but by the time the message reached the Muslim leadership, events were already spiralling out of control. Saladin's forces were scattered, dispersed for foraging and raiding. Units were miles apart. There was no time to concentrate, no possibility of forming a defensive line. The Christians had achieved total surprise through sheer audacity. The Crusader wedge hit the first scattered Muslim units like a thunderbolt. Medieval heavy cavalry at full charge was an almost unstoppable force. A fully armoured knight on an armoured warhorse weighed nearly a ton. At full gallop, that mass carried momentum that could smash through infantry formations, scatter lighter cavalry, and create zones of chaos wherever it struck. The initial impact was devastating. Muslim soldiers, caught unprepared, were literally ridden down. Lances punched through armour and flesh. War horses trampled men into the ground. The sheer shock of heavy cavalry suddenly appearing and charging created instant panic among the dispersed Muslim forces. But the real miracle was what happened next. Instead of bogging down in melee combat as medieval charges typically did, the Crusader wedge maintained momentum. The knights didn't stop to fight individual combats. They kept moving, kept charging, driving deeper into the Muslim positions, aiming directly toward where Saladin's command banners flew. This required discipline that most medieval armies couldn't maintain. Knights were trained to fight as individuals, to seek personal glory in single combat. Staying in formation, ignoring enemies on the flanks, driving forward regardless of what happened around you, went against every instinct. But Baldwin's knights did it, driven forward by desperation, faith, and the knowledge that stopping meant death. Contemporary Muslim chroniclers, writing years later when the shock had faded, still couldn't fully explain what happened. Imad ad-Din, Saladin's secretary and one of the most reliable Muslim sources, wrote that the Christian attack came like a sudden storm, that the army was scattered and unprepared, that panic spread faster than commands could be given. The Muslim forces, for all their numbers and experience, were psychologically unprepared for what was happening. They had expected frightened Christians cowering behind walls. Instead, they faced suicidal knights charging directly at them, with the absolute conviction of religious fanatics who welcomed martyrdom. The Crusader charge carved through the Muslim positions like a spear through cloth. Units that tried to stand and fight were overwhelmed by the sheer momentum of armoured cavalry. Those that tried to flee added to the chaos, blocking the movement of other units, preventing any coordinated response. Saladin's commanders, battle-hardened veterans all, found themselves unable to control their own men. The normal discipline of the Mamluk cavalry broke down in the face of unexpected shock. Horses panicked, men fled. The carefully organised professional army became a mob, and at the centre of the Christian charge, dying of leprosy, barely able to hold his reins, rode Baldwin. The king's presence on the battlefield had an effect beyond the military. For the Muslim soldiers, many of whom had heard stories of the Leper King, seeing him personally leading the charge was psychologically devastating. This wasn't a healthy warrior in his prime. This was a disease-ravaged teenager who by all logic should have been incapable of even sitting on a horse. Yet there he was, at the front of a suicide charge, clearly willing to die for his kingdom. It made the Muslims' numerical superiority seem irrelevant, made their confidence seem like hubris. If the Christian god could put a Leper King at the head of a victorious cavalry charge, what else might he do? The true cross, glittering at the centre of the Christian formation, added to the psychological impact. For medieval Christians, the presence of such a relic meant God was literally present on the battlefield, that miracles were not just possible but expected. For the Muslims, facing an enemy who believed this absolutely, who fought with the certainty of divine backing, the psychological effect was devastating. This wasn't just a battle, it was a test of religious truth. And in that moment, with the Christians charging impossibly forward and the Muslim army disintegrating around them, it seemed like perhaps the Christians were right, perhaps God was with them. Saladin himself nearly died in the chaos. The Crusader wedge, driving directly toward his command position, came terrifyingly close to killing or capturing Islam's greatest leader. Multiple contemporary accounts describe Saladin's bodyguard being scattered, the Sultan himself being forced to flee the field to avoid capture. For a commander of Saladin's stature and reputation, this was a humiliation almost worse than military defeat. He had been caught completely unprepared, his army scattered like sheep, and he had barely escaped with his life. The Muslim army's collapse was total. Units that had been spread across miles of territory, confident in their superiority, suddenly found themselves isolated and under attack. Christian knights, having broken through the initial positions, ranged across the battlefield hunting down fleeing Muslims. The Mamluks, normally the most disciplined cavalry in the world, fled in disorder. Supply trains were abandoned, equipment was left behind, men threw away weapons and armour to run faster. It wasn't a retreat, it was a rout. The total psychological collapse of an army that had believed itself invincible. Contemporary sources, Christian and Muslim alike, described the battlefield after Montgisard in apocalyptic terms. Thousands of Muslim dead littered the coastal plain. The exact numbers are disputed. Medieval chronicles always exaggerate casualty figures, but even conservative modern estimates put Muslim losses at over 3,000 killed, perhaps significantly more. For an army that had crossed into Christian territory expecting an easy raid, the disaster was catastrophic. Saladin's carefully cultivated image of invincibility was shattered. The unity he had been building across the Muslim world was damaged. His enemies, other Muslim rulers who resented his rise to power, saw weakness and opportunity. The Christian losses were remarkably light. Perhaps 750 killed according to some sources, maybe fewer. The nature of cavalry charges meant that either they succeeded spectacularly or failed catastrophically. There was no middle ground. Baldwin's charge had succeeded beyond any rational expectation. The combination of surprise, religious fervour, superior armour, and Saladin's dispersed deployment had created a perfect storm that allowed a vastly outnumbered force to win a devastating victory. But the true miracle of Montgisard wasn't just the military victory. It was Baldwin himself. The teenage Leper King had personally led the charge, had survived the battle, and had proven that even a dying boy could lead men to victory through sheer courage and faith. The psychological impact on both sides was immense. For the Christians, Baldwin became a living symbol of God's favour, proof that righteousness could overcome any obstacle. For the Muslims, the Leper King became something approaching a supernatural figure, a demon or a saint depending on perspective, but definitely someone blessed or cursed with power beyond the natural. Saladin retreated back to Egypt, his army broken, his reputation damaged, his grand strategy of destroying the Crusader kingdom set back by years. The Sultan would later rebuild, would eventually succeed in recapturing Jerusalem in 1187, but he never forgot Montgisard. In later negotiations with the Christians, he would reference the battle, acknowledge the defeat, treat Baldwin with a respect he showed to few others. The two men, the greatest Muslim warrior of the age and the dying Christian teenager, developed a strange mutual regard built on that single afternoon when faith and courage had triumphed over logic and numbers. For Baldwin, Montgisard was both triumph and curse. The exertion of the battle accelerated his disease. Leading a cavalry charge, the physical stress of controlling a warhorse while wearing armour, the impact of combat, all of it damaged his failing body. In the months and years after Montgisard, his condition worsened steadily. The leprosy spread. His face became increasingly disfigured. His hands lost more function. His eyesight began to fail. By his early 20s, he would be blind, unable to use his hands, his face covered by a mask to hide the ravages of disease. Yet he continued to rule, continued to lead armies, continued to defy the expectations of those who thought a leper had no place on a throne. The Battle of Montgisard remained the high point of Baldwin's reign. He would fight other battles, win other victories, but never again would he achieve such a spectacular triumph against such overwhelming odds. The miracle at Montgisard became legendary even during his lifetime. Chroniclers described it as divine intervention, as proof that God directly involved himself in human affairs when the cause was just. William of Tyre, Baldwin's old tutor, wrote of the battle with a mixture of awe and sorrow, celebrating the victory while mourning the physical cost to his former student. Baldwin died on March 16, 1185, just 24 years old, having ruled for 11 years despite a disease that should have killed him in childhood. His death was horrible, leprosy in its final stages causing ulceration, infection, and eventually organ failure. But he died as king, having saved his kingdom multiple times, having defied every expectation of what a diseased monarch could accomplish. His courage at Montgisard ensured that Jerusalem survived another decade, that the Crusader kingdoms endured, that the Christian presence in the Holy Land continued even after it seemed doomed. The military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, remembered Montgisard as the perfect example of faith overcoming worldly calculation. For centuries afterward, they told the story to new recruits as proof that God rewarded courage, that impossible battles could be won through righteousness, that death in holy combat was not an end but a beginning. The battle became part of Crusader mythology, a shining moment when everything had gone right, when the desperate gamble had paid off, when the Leper King had become legend. Saladin's defeat at Montgisard remained a rare stain on an otherwise brilliant military career. He would go on to unite the Muslim world, recapture Jerusalem in 1187, and become one of the most celebrated Muslim leaders in history. But he never forgot the teenage leper who had destroyed his army, the impossible victory that shouldn't have happened. In later years, when negotiating with Christian envoys, Saladin would sometimes reference Baldwin with something approaching admiration, acknowledging that the Leper King had possessed qualities that transcended mere military skill. Modern historians struggle with Montgisard because it defies rational military analysis. By every conventional measure, Baldwin should have lost. The numbers were impossibly against him. Saladin was a superior commander with a professional army. The Muslims held every advantage except surprise. Yet Baldwin won, decisively and completely. Trying to explain this through purely military factors, terrain, weather, tactical errors, feels inadequate because it misses the psychological and spiritual dimensions that medieval warfare possessed. The men who fought at Montgisard believed they were fighting not just for territory or political advantage but for eternal salvation. They believed God was watching, judging, intervening. They believed the true cross carried literal divine power. They believed a leper king leading them into battle was itself a miracle that required a miraculous outcome. And somehow, whether through divine intervention, incredible luck, or the power of absolute conviction, they were right. The impossible victory happened. The dying teenager won. The Christian kingdom survived. The Battle of Montgisard stands as one of the most remarkable military victories in history, not because of brilliant tactics or superior technology, but because of raw courage overcoming impossible odds. It demonstrated that sometimes, in rare moments, faith and desperation can achieve what calculation and experience say is impossible. It showed that leadership isn't about physical strength or health, but about will and conviction. And it proved that a dying 16-year-old leper could, for one glorious afternoon, be the greatest warrior in Christendom. 500 knights destroyed an army of 20,000. A teenage leper king led the charge that saved Jerusalem. The true cross blazed in the desert sun as Muslim soldiers fled in terror. It sounds like myth, like religious propaganda, like the kind of story that couldn't possibly be true, but it happened. On November 25th, 1177, at a place called Montgisard, the impossible became real, and for one brief shining moment, faith conquered reality, courage defeated numbers, and a dying boy became immortal. The aftermath of Montgisard rippled across the medieval world like an earthquake. Within weeks, news of the impossible victory spread through Europe, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and messengers. In Paris, London, Rome, and Constantinople, people heard the story of the Leper King who had destroyed Saladin's army and struggled to believe it. The Pope ordered Thanksgiving masses celebrated across Christendom. In the courts of Europe, nobles who had considered the Crusader kingdoms a lost cause suddenly reconsidered. Perhaps Jerusalem could be saved. Perhaps God truly did favour the Christians in the Holy Land. Perhaps this diseased teenager was something more than human. The political consequences were immediate and profound. Saladin's carefully constructed image as the inevitable unifier of Islam and destroyer of the Crusader states had been shattered in a single afternoon. Muslim rulers who had been considering submitting to his authority now hesitated. If the great Saladin could be defeated by a handful of Christian knights, led by a dying boy, perhaps he wasn't invincible after all. The emir of Aleppo, who had been negotiating alliance terms with Saladin, suddenly became far less cooperative. The caliph in Baghdad, who had been watching Saladin's rise with growing concern, felt emboldened to resist his influence. The unity Saladin had been building across the Muslim world fractured, setting his grand strategy back by years. For the Crusader states, Montgisard bought precious time. The kingdom of Jerusalem had been teetering on the edge of collapse, its resources exhausted, its manpower depleted, its future measured in months rather than years. The victory didn't solve these fundamental problems. The kingdom was still surrounded, still outnumbered, still dependent on reinforcements from Europe that arrived irregularly and often proved more troublesome than helpful. But Montgisard demonstrated that survival was possible, that courage and faith could overcome material disadvantage, that the Muslims were not invincible. It gave the Crusaders hope, that most valuable and dangerous of commodities in desperate circumstances. Baldwin himself emerged from the battle transformed in the eyes of his subjects. Before Montgisard, he had been King Baldwin the Leper, a figure of pity and concern, a dying boy who happened to wear a crown. After Montgisard, he became Baldwin the Victorious, the Leper King who defied death and enemies alike, a living miracle who proved that God's favour didn't depend on physical perfection. The disease that should have disqualified him from kingship became instead a mark of divine selection. If God could work through a leper, then clearly he had purposes that transcended human understanding. The physical cost of the battle, however, was devastating. Leading a cavalry charge while suffering from advanced leprosy accelerated Baldwin's decline in ways that are difficult for modern people to fully appreciate. Leprosy attacks the peripheral nervous system, destroying the body's ability to sense pain and temperature. This means injuries go unnoticed until they become severe. The stress of controlling a warhorse during combat, the impact of wearing heavy armour, the minor cuts and bruises that any warrior accumulates in battle, all of these would have caused damage that Baldwin couldn't feel, but that his diseased body couldn't properly heal. Within months of Montgisard, courtiers noticed the king's condition worsening. His hands, already partially paralysed, lost more function. The characteristic leonine facial features of leprosy became more pronounced as the disease attacked the cartilage and bone structure of his face. His eyesight, which had been deteriorating slowly, began to fail more rapidly. By 1179, just 2 years after Montgisard, Baldwin was having difficulty seeing clearly. By 1183, he would be functionally blind, requiring others to describe battlefield situations to him, while he gave orders he could not personally observe being carried out. Yet Baldwin continued to rule with a determination that bordered on the superhuman. Medieval kingship required physical presence. A king had to be seen by his subjects, had to lead armies personally, had to sit in judgment, had to embody the state in his own person. For a king whose face was becoming a mask of disease, whose hands could barely hold a pen, whose eyes could not see the faces of those he commanded, maintaining this presence required extraordinary willpower. Baldwin did it through sheer force of personality and the loyalty he had earned at Montgisard. The court adapted to accommodate their dying king. Special arrangements were made for audiences so that Baldwin could participate without exposing his deteriorating face to unnecessary scrutiny. Scribes took on more responsibility for actual writing while the king dictated. Trusted advisors described battlefield situations in detail so Baldwin could make tactical decisions despite his blindness. It was an improvised system that shouldn't have worked but did because everyone involved desperately wanted it to work. The alternative was acknowledging that the king who had saved Jerusalem was no longer capable of ruling, and that acknowledgement would have destroyed the kingdom's morale. Saladin, meanwhile, was rebuilding his forces and his reputation. The defeat at Montgisard stung, but the Sultan was nothing if not resilient. He had survived worse setbacks in his rise to power, and had always recovered through patience, planning, and the ability to learn from mistakes. He would not be caught dispersed and unprepared again. His next campaigns against the Crusaders would be conducted with overwhelming force, careful reconnaissance, and none of the overconfidence that had doomed him at Montgisard. The two men, Baldwin and Saladin, developed a strange relationship conducted through messengers, captured prisoners, and occasional truces. They never met face to face, but they understood each other in ways that transcended the religious divide. Both were deeply pious men fighting for what they believed was God's will. Both were highly intelligent, capable of seeing beyond immediate tactical concerns to larger strategic realities. Both were trapped by circumstances into a conflict neither truly wanted but both believed was necessary. Saladin respected Baldwin's courage and political acumen. Baldwin respected Saladin's military genius and personal honour. In another time, under different circumstances, they might have been allies. Instead, they were enemies bound by mutual respect and the knowledge that only one could ultimately prevail. In 1179, Saladin launched a new offensive, having learned the lessons of Montgisard. This time his army advanced in tight formation, with extensive reconnaissance, ready for immediate combat at all times. The campaign culminated in the Battle of Marjayoun on June 10th, where Saladin decisively defeated a Crusader force that attempted to intercept his army. The Muslim victory was total. The Crusaders lost heavily, including many of the knights who had survived Montgisard. It was Saladin's revenge, proof that Montgisard had been an aberration, that the fundamental balance of power still favoured the Muslims. Baldwin, though his health continued to deteriorate, refused to surrender to despair. He understood what many of his nobles did not, that the Crusader kingdoms could not win through military victory alone. They were too outnumbered, too isolated, too dependent on external support. Their only hope was to make conquest so costly that Saladin would accept a negotiated peace, to demonstrate that while the Christians might ultimately lose, they would make the Muslims pay such a price that the victory would be Pyrrhic. This strategy required something the feudal nobility often lacked: patience and strategic thinking beyond personal glory. Baldwin spent much of his declining years trying to manage the competing egos and ambitions of his nobles, trying to prevent them from launching reckless attacks that would waste their limited military strength, trying to maintain alliances with the other Crusader states that were often more interested in their own survival than Jerusalem's. It was exhausting work for a healthy man. For a blind leper, it was nearly impossible. That Baldwin succeeded as well as he did is testament to his political genius and the personal loyalty he inspired. The succession crisis began to dominate court politics as Baldwin's health failed. He had no children, his disease and unmarried status ensured that. His heir was his sister Sibylla, married to Guy of Lusignan, a European noble who'd come east seeking fortune and found a crown within reach. Guy was handsome, ambitious, and almost completely incompetent as a military commander. Baldwin saw this clearly despite his blindness, and did everything he could to prevent Guy from inheriting real power. In 1183, Baldwin had his nephew, Sibylla's son from her first marriage, crowned as co-king Baldwin V. The child was only 5 years old, but Baldwin hoped to ensure the succession would skip Guy entirely. It was a desperate political maneuver by a dying king trying to protect his kingdom beyond his own death. Baldwin IV knew he had months, perhaps weeks, left to live. The leprosy had progressed to its final stages. His body was failing in ways that even medieval medicine couldn't ignore, yet he continued to rule, continued to plan, continued to fight for Jerusalem's survival with whatever tools remained to him. His face was now completely masked to hide the ravages of disease. His hands were useless, his eyes were blind. But his mind remained sharp and his will unbroken. The final campaigns of Baldwin's reign were conducted largely by his regents and commanders, but the strategy was still his. He understood that Saladin was waiting, building strength, preparing for the final assault that would recapture Jerusalem. Every month the Crusader kingdom survived was a month they could receive reinforcements from Europe, a month they could strengthen fortifications, a month they could prepare for the inevitable. Baldwin used diplomacy, careful husbanding of military resources, and strategic defence to buy that time. In 1184, Saladin made another major incursion into Crusader territory. His army besieged the fortress of Kerak, one of the most important Crusader strongholds east of the Dead Sea. The siege occurred during a wedding celebration, and Saladin's forces surrounded the castle while festivities continued inside. It was a surreal situation, with a wedding feast happening while siege engines battered the walls. Baldwin, though barely alive, organised a relief force. He couldn't lead it personally. His body had finally failed to the point where mounting a horse was impossible. Instead, he was carried on a litter at the head of the army, a blind masked figure who could no longer see or fight but whose presence still inspired his men. The relief of Kerak was Baldwin's last campaign. The sight of the Leper King being carried toward battle in a litter, clearly dying but still refusing to abandon his kingdom, had a profound effect on both sides. Crusader morale surged. How could they give up when their king, reduced to a living corpse, still fought? Saladin's forces, seeing the litter approaching, reportedly felt a superstitious dread. The Leper King should have been dead years ago. That he still lived, still led armies, still defied them, seemed unnatural, miraculous, terrifying. Saladin lifted the siege and withdrew, unwilling to face Baldwin one more time. It was the last victory Baldwin would achieve. He returned to Jerusalem knowing death was imminent. The leprosy had reached its final stage. His body was shutting down. Infection was spreading through his system. The pain, which leprosy sufferers often don't feel in their extremities, was now systemic and constant. Medieval medicine could do nothing. The king was dying, and everyone knew it. Baldwin spent his final weeks trying to secure the succession, trying to ensure that Guy of Lusignan would not inherit real power, trying to protect the kingdom he had saved at Montgisard from the political incompetence he saw coming. He partially succeeded. His nephew Baldwin V was crowned co-king, arrangements were made for a regency council that would govern until the child came of age. It was the best Baldwin could do given the constraints of feudal law and political reality. On March 16, 1185, King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem died. He was 24 years old and had ruled for 11 years. His death was recorded by William of Tyre and other chroniclers with genuine grief. This was not the conventional sorrow at a king's passing. This was mourning for a remarkable human being who had transcended the limitations of his diseased body through sheer force of will and faith. The Leper King who should have died as a child, who had saved Jerusalem at Montgisard, who had defied Saladin in disease and political chaos, was finally gone. The funeral was elaborate by necessity and understated by choice. Baldwin's body, ravaged by leprosy, was prepared for burial according to both royal protocol and medical necessity. He was interred in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holiest site in Christianity beside his father and grandfather. The tomb was marked but not ostentatious. Baldwin had lived without vanity and died the same way. His legacy was not monuments but survival. He had bought Jerusalem 11 more years through personal courage and political acumen. That it would fall to Saladin just 2 years after his death doesn't diminish his achievement. It underscores how much the kingdom had depended on his leadership. The succession Baldwin had tried so carefully to arrange collapsed almost immediately after his death. His nephew Baldwin V died in 1186, possibly poisoned though the evidence is unclear, and Guy of Lusignan became king through his marriage to Sibylla. Guy proved to be exactly as incompetent as Baldwin had feared. Within a year, he made the catastrophic decisions that led to the Battle of Hattin, the greatest disaster in Crusader history. Saladin destroyed the Christian army, captured Guy, and recaptured Jerusalem in October 1187. The city Baldwin had saved at Montgisard fell just 2 years after his death, almost as if his personal will had been the only thing keeping it Christian. But the story of Baldwin and Montgisard didn't end with Jerusalem's fall. The battle became legendary across both Christian and Muslim worlds. For Christians, it was proof that faith could move mountains, that God intervened directly in human affairs, that righteousness could triumph over any odds. For Muslims, it was a cautionary tale about overconfidence, a reminder that victory was never certain, a strange story about a leper king who had achieved the impossible through courage that commanded respect even from his enemies. Saladin, who finally achieved his life's goal of recapturing Jerusalem, reportedly wept when he learned of Baldwin's earlier death. The Sultan had fought many enemies, but few had earned his respect the way the Leper King had. In later years, when discussing the Crusades with his advisors, Saladin would sometimes reference Baldwin as the most formidable opponent he had faced, not because of military genius, but because of moral courage that transcended normal human limitations. The man who had humiliated him at Montgisard had earned something more valuable than victory. He had earned the enemy's respect. The military orders preserved the memory of Montgisard with particular reverence. For the Templars and Hospitallers, warrior monks sworn to defend Christianity in the Holy Land, Baldwin represented the ideal fusion of faith and martial prowess. That he was a leper, traditionally considered unclean and cursed, made his achievements even more miraculous. The orders told and retold the story of Montgisard to new recruits for centuries, using it to illustrate that God's favour wasn't limited by human weakness, that impossible battles could be won through faith, that death in righteous combat was not an end but a gateway to eternal glory. Medieval chroniclers struggled to explain Baldwin's achievements within their understanding of divine providence and natural law. A leper king was an inherent contradiction. Leprosy was widely believed to be punishment for sin, a physical manifestation of spiritual corruption. Yet Baldwin was clearly a righteous man, pious, just, courageous, effective. How could God curse him with leprosy while simultaneously blessing him with victory? The theological gymnastics required to reconcile this paradox-filled volumes of medieval commentary. The most common resolution was that God had tested Baldwin more severely than most men precisely because he had greater plans for him, that the leprosy was not punishment but preparation, a way of stripping away worldly vanity and pride to reveal the pure will and faith underneath. Modern historians approach Baldwin with different questions but similar awe. From a military history perspective, Montgisard remains one of the most remarkable victories in medieval warfare, possibly in all of military history. The odds were so overwhelmingly against the Crusaders that the victory seems almost inexplicable without invoking either massive incompetence on Saladin's part or genuine divine intervention. The reality is probably somewhere in between. Saladin made a serious tactical error in allowing his army to become dispersed. Baldwin made a brilliant strategic decision to attack immediately, rather than waiting for conditions to improve. The Crusader charge achieved total surprise and exploited it ruthlessly. The combination of factors created a perfect storm that allowed the impossible to happen. From a medical perspective, Baldwin's case is fascinating and tragic. Modern diagnosis suggests he suffered from tuberculoid leprosy, the less severe form of the disease but still devastating. That he survived to age 24 while actively ruling a kingdom and personally leading battles is remarkable. The disease should have killed him much earlier, or at minimum rendered him incapable of physical activity years before his death. That he continued functioning, continued leading, continued fighting, suggests either he was an extreme outlier in disease progression, or his sheer willpower somehow delayed the inevitable. Medical science doesn't really allow for willpower affecting disease progression, but Baldwin's case makes you wonder. From a human perspective, Baldwin's story is simply extraordinary. Imagine being 13 years old and being told you have leprosy, that you're going to die young after a horrible physical decline, that your body will rot while your mind remains clear, and that you should abandon any hopes of a normal life. Now imagine being crowned king anyway, being expected to lead armies and govern a kingdom while your flesh falls away, being required to project strength and confidence while your body fails. Most people would break under that pressure. Baldwin thrived. Not just survived, but thrived, achieving military victories, managing complex politics, inspiring loyalty and courage in others, becoming a legend. The strength of character required is almost beyond comprehension. The Ridley Scott film Kingdom of Heaven, released in 2005, introduced Baldwin to a modern audience, portraying him as a wise, doomed king trying to preserve peace while surrounded by hot-headed fools. The film takes substantial historical liberties, but captures something essential about Baldwin's character: the dignity, the courage, the knowledge that he's dying, but determination to make his remaining time matter. Edward Norton's portrayal, performed entirely behind a silver mask that hides the actor's face completely, somehow conveys tremendous humanity and strength. It's an appropriate metaphor for Baldwin's life, remarkable character expressed through a damaged exterior. What makes Baldwin's story endure across centuries is that it touches something fundamental about human nature. We want to believe that physical limitations don't define us, that courage and will can overcome disabilities, that righteousness can triumph over material advantage. Baldwin's life proves all of these things are possible, not through fantasy or exaggeration, but through documented historical fact. He was a leper who became a warrior king. He was a dying teenager who defeated the greatest Muslim commander of his age. He was everything medieval prejudice said was impossible, and he did it anyway. The Battle of Montgisard itself has become something of a historical Rorschach test. How you interpret it reveals your assumptions about history, faith, and human capability. If you believe God intervenes directly in human affairs, Montgisard is obvious proof. If you believe in purely material explanations, it's a statistical outlier, a combination of lucky circumstances that happen to favour the underdog. If you believe in the power of morale and psychology in warfare, it's an example of how absolute conviction can overcome material disadvantage. All of these interpretations have merit. None fully explains what happened. What we know for certain is this. On November 25th, 1177, approximately 500 Christian knights charged an army of over 20,000 Muslim soldiers. The Christians were led by a 16-year-old Leper King who was visibly dying. They carried with them a piece of wood they believed was part of Christ's cross. They charged without hesitation, without tactical subtlety, with absolute faith that righteousness would prevail. And they won. Decisively, completely, impossibly. They shattered Saladin's army, saved Jerusalem, and created a legend that has endured for 850 years. Baldwin lived 8 more years after Montgisard, each year harder than the last as his disease progressed. He ruled blind, paralysed, masked, his body failing in incremental stages, while his mind remained clear and his will unbroken. He fought more battles, negotiated more truces, managed more political crises. He did everything a healthy king would do, except he did it while dying of one of history's most feared diseases, and when death finally came, it came not as defeat, but as relief. He had done what he set out to do. He had defended Jerusalem. He had fulfilled his duty as king. He had proven that faith and courage could overcome anything, even leprosy, even impossible odds, even death itself. The tomb of Baldwin IV still exists in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. It's not particularly impressive as royal tombs go. No elaborate sculptures or precious metals, just stone marked with an inscription identifying the occupant. Thousands of tourists pass it every year, most barely noticing it among the church's many historical treasures. But those who know the story stop and pause. They remember the Leper King who saved Jerusalem. They remember Montgisard, where faith conquered reality. They remember that once, long ago, a dying teenage boy proved that courage matters more than health, that righteousness can defeat numbers, and that sometimes, just sometimes, miracles actually happen.